The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sagebrush and red rock that could swallow a person whole. But Rebecca Hayes had never felt swallowed by it. At 24, she'd been living alone on her family's abandoned homestead. For 8 years, surviving on her wits, her rifle, and a stubbornness that ran deeper than the canyon walls. She'd grown accustomed to the silence, to the way her own voice sounded strange when she spoke to the chickens or read aloud from her father's old books by lamplight. What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the sight of 6 Apache warriors cresting the ridge at sunset, their massive frames silhouetted against the burning sky, riding toward her small cabin with the purposeful stride of men who had traveled far to find something specific, something they believed was worth the journey. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see that these weren't raiders or wanderers. Their horses were magnificent, their bearing proud and deliberate. The lead rider, a man whose presence commanded attention even from a distance, raised his hand in a gesture that was neither threatening nor submissive. It was the gesture of an equal seeking counsel. They had come for her. And somehow, in the depths of her isolated heart, Rebecca Hayes knew that her 8 years of solitude were about to end in a way she could never have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Hayes hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks when she heard the sound that would change everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why 6 Apache warriors would ride across hostile territory to seek out a solitary white woman, you need to understand who Rebecca Hayes was, and more importantly, how she'd become the kind of person who could survive and thrive completely alone in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in America. The Hayes homestead sat in a valley, 20 miles northeast of what would someday become Flagstaff, Arizona. In 1884, it might as well have been on the moon. The nearest neighbor was a day's hard ride away, the nearest town 3 days if the weather held. It was the kind of place that broke most people within a year, driving them back to civilization with stories of impossible isolation and endless, crushing silence. Rebecca's father, Samuel Hayes, had been different. A former cavalry scout with steel gray eyes and hands that never trembled. Samuel had looked at this harsh valley and seen possibility where others saw only hardship. He'd brought his wife Martha and their 16-year-old daughter west in 1876, following dreams of land ownership and independence that the crowded cities of Ohio couldn't provide. For 8 years, the Hayes family had carved out a life from the unforgiving desert. Samuel proved to be a master of desert survival, teaching himself to read weather patterns in the flight of birds, to find water by watching how the morning light caught certain rock formations, to predict Apache movements by understanding their seasonal hunting patterns. Martha, delicate-looking but tough as rawhide, had transformed their simple cabin into a home, creating a garden that shouldn't have thrived but did, raising chickens that laid eggs despite the heat, and preserving food in ways that defied the harsh climate. Rebecca absorbed it all. While other 16-year-old girls were learning needlepoint and proper conversation, she was learning to track wounded deer across rocky terrain, to repair harnesses and fix wagon wheels, to shoot accurately at distances that would impress most cavalry soldiers. Her education came from her father's collection of books, Shakespeare and Dickens, alongside military strategy manuals and geological surveys, and from the hard-earned wisdom of people who had learned to live with the land rather than against it. The Apache respected the Hayes family in a way that was unusual for white settlers. Samuel had made it clear from the beginning that he wasn't trying to claim vast territories or drive away the native inhabitants. His homestead was small, his presence respectful. When Apache hunting parties passed through the valley, Samuel would approach them openly, offering trade goods and showing that he posed no threat. Over the years, a cautious understanding had developed, not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition of competence and honor. Rebecca remembered those encounters clearly. The Apache warriors were unlike any men she'd ever seen, tall, powerfully built, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of lives spent in perfect harmony with their environment. They carried themselves with a dignity that impressed her even as a teenager, and their eyes held an intelligence and depth that contradicted every stereotype she'd heard about savage Indians from the few travelers who occasionally passed through. Then came 1884, and everything changed in the space of a single terrible week. It started with Martha's cough. Just a small thing at first, barely noticeable. But in a place where the nearest doctor was 100 miles away, small things had a way of becoming big things very quickly. The cough worsened, developed into a fever, then into something that left Martha struggling for breath and burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease. Samuel nursed his wife with the desperate intensity of a man who understood exactly how alone they were. Rebecca helped as best she could, but she could see in her father's eyes that he knew they were losing a battle against something beyond their ability to fight. Martha Hayes died on a Tuesday morning in late October, holding her husband's hand and whispering instructions to Rebecca about where she'd hidden her mother's jewelry and which herbs worked best for headaches. The grief hit Samuel like a physical blow. The man who had never shown fear in the face of mountain lions or flash floods crumbled under the weight of losing the woman who had been his partner in creating their desert life. He continued going through the motions of daily survival, but Rebecca could see that something essential had broken inside him. 3 weeks after Martha's death, Samuel was checking their small herd of cattle when his horse stepped wrong and threw him into a dry wash. The fall itself wasn't fatal, but the broken leg that resulted from it became infected despite Rebecca's best efforts to treat it. Without proper medical care, the infection spread, and Samuel Hayes, the man who had seemed indestructible, died in his own bed 6 days later, delirious with fever and calling out Martha's name. At 24 years old, Rebecca Hayes found herself completely alone in a place where survival required skills that most people never learned and strength that most people never developed. The logical thing would have been to pack up her belongings, abandon the homestead, and return to civilization. The safe thing would have been to sell the land to speculators and use the money to start over somewhere easier, somewhere with neighbors and doctors and stores. Rebecca chose to stay. The decision wasn't entirely rational, and she knew it. But this valley had been her home for 8 years. Her parents were buried in the small cemetery Samuel had established behind the cabin, marked with wooden crosses he'd carved himself. Their life's work, the carefully maintained garden, the improved cabin, the relationships with local Apache tribes represented something too valuable to abandon. More than that, Rebecca had discovered something about herself during those first terrible weeks alone. She was good at this life, better than good. The skills her father had taught her weren't just adequate for survival. They made her genuinely competent in ways that few people ever achieved. She could track game across terrain that confused experienced hunters. She could predict weather patterns days in advance by reading subtle changes in wind direction and animal behavior. She could repair or improve virtually anything, mechanical through careful observation and patient experimentation. Living alone required her to become completely self-sufficient in ways that would have been impossible in civilization. She learned to preserve meat through smoking and salt-curing techniques that kept it edible for months. She expanded her mother's garden, developing irrigation methods that brought water from a seasonal stream nearly a mile away. She improved the cabin's design, adding features that made it more efficient and comfortable during the extreme temperature variations of desert life. The isolation that would have driven most people to madness became, for Rebecca, a source of strange peace. She developed routines that structured her days and gave purpose to her solitude. Mornings were for checking and maintaining the homestead, feeding chickens, tending the garden, inspecting the cabin and outbuildings for needed repairs. Afternoons were for hunting or gathering, depending on the season and their current supplies. Evenings were for reading, writing in the journal she'd started keeping, and planning improvements or expansions to their small operation. She talked to the animals, of course. Long conversations with the chickens about weather and wild predators. Detailed discussions with her horse about the best routes to various hunting areas. Philosophical debates with the barn cat about the relative merits of different types of mice. It wasn't madness. She never forgot that they were animals, but it helped maintain her ability to speak clearly and think through problems aloud. The few travelers who encountered Rebecca during her years of solitude always commented on her striking appearance. 8 years of outdoor life had given her a lean, athletic build that moved with unconscious grace. Her auburn hair, usually braided practically back from her face, caught the desert sunlight like burnished copper. Her green eyes had developed the kind of steady, direct gaze that came from scanning horizons for signs of weather or wildlife or potential threats. She dressed practically men's trousers modified to fit her frame, cotton shirts in earth tones that didn't show dust, boots that were functional rather than fashionable, but it was her bearing that impressed people most. Rebecca carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real challenges and proven equal to them. She spoke when she had something worth saying, listened carefully to others, and possessed the kind of practical competence that commanded respect from anyone who understood frontier life. Word of the solitary woman, who had successfully maintained a homestead alone for years, began to spread through the scattered communities of the Arizona Territory. Traders mentioned her to other traders. Cavalry patrols noted her competence in their reports. Apache hunting parties spoke of her with the kind of respect usually reserved for proven warriors. The stories grew with each telling, as stories do. Some claimed she could shoot the wings off a flying hawk at 100 yards. Others insisted she'd once tracked a wounded mountain lion for 3 days through rocky terrain before finishing it with a single shot. A few maintained that she'd negotiated a peace treaty with a band of hostile Apache, using nothing but sign language and sheer force of personality. Most of the stories were exaggerated, but they contained enough truth to create a reputation that spread far beyond her small valley. Rebecca Hayes had become something unusual in the American West, a woman who had proven that competence and determination could overcome almost any obstacle, including the crushing isolation that broke most solitary settlers within months. She had no idea that her reputation had reached Apache ears, or that it had interested them for reasons that went far beyond simple respect for a skilled survivor. She didn't know that tribal councils had discussed her, that warriors had debated her character, or that certain powerful men had begun to see her as the answer to problems that went to the heart of their people's future. All she knew was that she had built a life that satisfied her, alone in a place that most people couldn't survive for a week. She had proven to herself that she could be completely self-reliant, that she could create meaning and purpose without depending on others for validation or support, which made it all the more surprising when, on a clear October evening in 1884, exactly 8 years after her family had first arrived in the valley, she heard the sound of approaching horses and looked up to see 6 Apache warriors riding toward her cabin with the measured pace of men who had traveled far and intended to be heard. Rebecca set down the harness she'd been mending and reached for her rifle, not out of fear but out of the practical caution that had kept her alive for 8 years of solitude. As the riders drew closer, she could see that they were magnificent, tall, powerfully built men mounted on horses that spoke of wealth and careful breeding. Their weapons were visible but not threatening, their approach direct but respectful. Lead rider raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, and Rebecca found herself responding in kind, lowering her rifle but keeping it ready. Whatever these men wanted, whatever had brought them across dangerous territory to seek her out, she sensed that her 8 years of careful solitude were about to end in a way that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 6 Apache warriors who rode into Rebecca Hayes's valley that October evening carried with them the weight of tribal tradition stretching back centuries, and the burden of a decision that would either save their people or destroy everything their ancestors had built. Their leader, Joseph Crow Feather, was a man whose very presence commanded attention. At 32, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and arms, corded with the kind of muscle that came from a lifetime of wielding weapons and controlling powerful horses. His black hair hung to his shoulders, secured with a band of worked silver that caught the dying sunlight. But it was his eyes that marked him as different from other men, dark, intelligent, and carrying the weight of responsibilities that would have crushed lesser leaders. Joseph was the war chief of the Tonto Apache, a position he'd earned not through birthright, but through a combination of tactical brilliance, physical courage, and the rare ability to see beyond immediate conflicts to long-term survival. He'd led his people through 12 years of increasingly desperate warfare against the U.S. Army, always staying one step ahead of forces that outnumbered them 10 to 1, always finding ways to protect his tribe when protection seemed impossible. Behind him rode his 5 closest companions, each a warrior of legendary skill whose presence on this mission spoke to its unprecedented importance. There was Daniel Stormwolf, Joseph's childhood friend and most trusted advisor, a man whose ability to read terrain and predict enemy movements had saved their band countless times. Robert Iron Bear, the tribe's greatest tracker, could follow a week-old trail across solid rock and had once stalked an army patrol for 6 days without being detected. Michael Thunderhorse, barely 25 but already famous throughout Apache territory for his marksmanship and his ability to break wild horses that no one else could touch. Samuel Broken Arrow, the eldest at 43, whose strategic mind had planned most of their successful raids and whose counsel Joseph valued above all others. And finally, David Red Eagle, whose diplomatic skills had negotiated temporary truces with Mexican authorities and whose knowledge of white culture made him invaluable in dealing with the changing world around them. These 6 men represented the heart of Apache resistance in central Arizona territory. They were the inner council that planned raids, negotiated with other tribes, and made the life and death decisions that kept their people alive in an increasingly hostile world. For all of them to leave their responsibilities and ride together into potentially dangerous territory spoke to a mission of extraordinary significance. The mission that had brought them to Rebecca Hayes's valley was born from a crisis that threatened to end their people's existence as a free tribe. 3 months earlier, word had reached them through their network of scouts and informants that the U.S. Army was planning a final campaign to force all remaining free Apache onto reservations. Unlike previous attempts, this campaign would be led by General George Crook, a man whose understanding of Apache tactics and whose willingness to use Apache scouts against their own people had already broken the resistance of tribes throughout the Southwest. The Tonto Apache faced a choice that was no choice at all: surrender and accept life on a reservation where they would be dependent on government handouts and gradually lose their identity as a people, or fight a hopeless war against overwhelming odds that could only end in their complete destruction. But Joseph Crow Feather had identified a third option, one so audacious and unprecedented that it had taken months of careful argument to convince his council to approve it. The plan required them to do something that violated every tradition of Apache warfare and diplomacy. They would need to form an alliance with whites, not as enemies or victims, but as equals. The key to this alliance lay in an ancient Apache law that even Joseph had been reluctant to invoke. According to tradition dating back centuries, a woman who could prove her worth as a warrior and provider could be offered marriage by any Apache man who respected her abilities, regardless of her tribal affiliation. The law existed to prevent the loss of valuable skills and knowledge, allowing exceptional women from captured or allied tribes to become full members of Apache society. The law had never been used to marry a white woman. The very idea would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and Rebecca Hayes was not a normal white woman. For over 2 years, Joseph's scouts had been observing the solitary woman who maintained a homestead alone in territory that few men could survive. Their reports had created a picture of someone whose skills and character challenged everything the Apache thought they knew about white settlers. Here was a woman who lived by many of the same principles that guided Apache life: self-reliance, respect for the land, the ability to take only what was needed and waste nothing, the courage to face danger without flinching. More importantly, Rebecca's situation made her a potential ally rather than an enemy. She had no family ties to the army or to the settlers who were demanding Apache removal. She had no economic interests in mining or ranching operations that required large amounts of land. She was, essentially, a white woman who had chosen to live like an Apache, making her living through skill and determination rather than through the exploitation of others. The plan that Joseph proposed to his council was complex and risky, but it offered possibilities that no other strategy could provide. If Rebecca Hayes could be convinced to marry one of their warriors, thereby becoming legally Apache according to both tribal law and potentially territorial law, she could serve as a bridge between their people and the white authorities. An Apache woman who was also legally white could negotiate treaties, own land, and represent tribal interests in ways that would be impossible for traditional Apache leaders. But the plan required more than just marriage. It required a woman willing to become truly Apache, to take on not just the legal status, but the responsibilities and loyalties that came with tribal membership. It required someone whose character had already been tested by the kind of hardships that revealed a person's true nature. The decision to send 6 warriors instead of 1 reflected both the importance of the mission and the unprecedented nature of what they were proposing. In Apache culture, a marriage proposal was typically a private matter between individuals and their families. But this proposal would be a diplomatic mission with implications for the survival of their entire people. The presence of multiple warriors demonstrated the seriousness of their offer and provided the kind of formal diplomatic protocol that such an important negotiation deserved. Each of the 6 men had volunteered to be the prospective bridegroom, understanding that whoever married Rebecca Hayes would be taking on responsibilities far beyond those of a normal husband. He would be committing to a life that bridged 2 worlds, acting as a cultural translator and diplomat as well as a spouse. He would need to help Rebecca understand Apache ways while also learning from her knowledge of white culture and law. Most importantly, he would be gambling his personal happiness on a strategic alliance that might fail despite everyone's best efforts. The choice of which warrior would actually propose marriage had been left deliberately open. The plan was to approach Rebecca as a group, explain their situation honestly, and allow her to choose among them based on her own judgment of character and compatibility. It was an arrangement that violated traditional Apache courtship customs. But then, everything about this mission violated tradition. As they rode through the desert toward Rebecca's valley, each man contemplated what this decision might mean for his own life. Joseph Crow Feather, despite his position as war chief, was perhaps the most conflicted. His first responsibility was to his people's survival, but he was also a man who had never married, partly because his duties as a leader left little time for personal relationships, and partly because he had never met a woman whose strength matched his own. Daniel Stormwolf, riding beside his longtime friend, understood Joseph's conflict better than anyone. The 2 men had grown up together, had fought side by side in dozens of battles, and had shared the burden of leadership as their people faced increasingly desperate circumstances. Daniel knew that Joseph was drawn to the idea of a woman who could be a true partner in leadership, someone whose abilities were proven rather than assumed, whose loyalty would be chosen rather than inherited. Robert Iron Bear, the tracker, approached the mission with the same methodical patience he brought to following difficult trails. He had observed Rebecca from a distance on several occasions during his scouting missions, had watched her work with the focused efficiency that marked Apache, true professional. What impressed him most was her relationship with the land she moved through the desert, with the kind of awareness that came from genuine understanding rather than mere survival instinct. Michael Thunderhorse, the youngest of the group, was frankly curious about what kind of woman could survive alone in territory that challenged experienced warriors. His reputation for handling difficult horses came from his ability to read animal psychology, to understand what motivated behavior and how to work with natural instincts rather than against them. He wondered if the same skills might apply to understanding a woman whose life had required her to develop capabilities that few people ever needed. Samuel Broken Arrow, the strategist, saw the mission primarily in terms of its potential to change the balance of power between the Apache and their enemies. But he was also a man who had been married for 15 years to a woman whose intelligence and strength had been crucial to his own success as a leader. He understood better than the younger men what it meant to find a true partner, someone whose abilities complemented and enhanced your own rather than simply supporting them. David Red Eagle, the diplomat, was perhaps best equipped to understand the cultural complexities of what they were proposing. His negotiations with Mexican authorities had taught him that successful alliances required more than just shared interests. They required genuine respect and understanding between people from different backgrounds. He knew that any marriage resulting from this mission would need to be built on more than strategic convenience. As the sun set behind the mountains and Rebecca's cabin came into view, all 6 men felt the weight of history settling on their shoulders. They were about to attempt something that had never been tried before, something that could either open new possibilities for their people's survival or create new forms of conflict that would make their situation even more desperate. The success or failure of their mission would depend entirely on the character and judgment of a woman they had never met, a woman whose reputation among both whites and Apache spoke of abilities that matched their own. They were asking her to abandon the life she had built for herself and join them in creating something entirely new, a marriage that would be both personal and political, both strategic and genuine. As they approached her cabin in the gathering darkness, each man wondered if Rebecca Hayes would prove to be the remarkable woman their scouts had described, and whether she would have the courage to join them in an alliance that could change the future of the American Southwest. The moment the 6 Apache warriors dismounted from their horses, Rebecca Hayes knew this encounter would be unlike anything in her 8 years of solitary life. These weren't raiders seeking easy targets or scouts testing her defenses. The deliberate way they arranged themselves in a semicircle before her cabin, the formal bearing with which they approached, and most tellingly, the fact that their weapons remained secured, spoke of a diplomatic mission. Joseph Crow Feather stepped forward first, his imposing frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight that spilled from Rebecca's open doorway. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, marked by the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned the language as a tool of survival rather than comfort. "Rebecca Hayes," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the evening. I am Joseph Crow Feather, war chief of the Tonto Apache. These are my brothers in arms. We have traveled far to speak with you about a matter of great importance to both our peoples." Rebecca kept her rifle ready but pointed downward, a gesture that acknowledged their peaceful approach while maintaining her ability to defend herself if necessary. Her 8 years of isolation had taught her to read situations quickly and accurately, and everything about these men suggested they had come to negotiate rather than to threaten. "Mr. Crow Feather," she replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, You're welcome to speak. I assume this isn't a social call, given the distance you've traveled and the fact that you've brought 5 witnesses. A slight smile crossed Joseph's face at her directness. The reports about Rebecca Hayes had mentioned her practical nature and her ability to cut through social niceties to reach the heart of matters. It was a trait that Apache culture valued highly, and it suggested that the conversations ahead might be more straightforward than he had dared hope. "You assume correctly," he said. "What we have come to discuss will sound strange to your ears, perhaps impossible. But I ask that you hear us completely before you decide whether we speak with wisdom or madness." Rebecca gestured toward the rough-hewn bench that sat on her small porch. "I've learned that impossible things happen regularly out here. I'm listening." Joseph remained standing, understanding that what he was about to say required the formality of traditional Apache diplomatic protocol. "For 3 summers, our scouts have observed you living alone in this place. They have watched you hunt with skill that rivals our best warriors. They have seen you track wounded animals across terrain that confuses experienced men. They have noted how you take only what you need from the land and waste nothing, how you treat the desert with the respect it demands." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "In our culture, such abilities mark someone as worthy of the highest respect, regardless of their birth or tribal affiliation. You have proven yourself according to the standards by which we judge our own people." Rebecca felt a flush of unexpected pride at this recognition, but she also sensed that Joseph was building towards something much larger than simple compliments. "I appreciate your observations, Mr. Crowfeather. But I suspect there's more to this visit than acknowledging my hunting skills." "There is." Joseph's expression grew more serious, carrying the weight of the unprecedented proposal he was about to make. "My people face extinction. The U.S. Army is planning a final campaign to force all free Apache onto reservations. We can fight and die as warriors, or we can surrender and watch our children forget what it means to be Apache. Both paths lead to the end of our people as we have been for 1,000 generations." The stark honesty of his statement hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had heard rumors of increased military activity in the territory, but her isolation had shielded her from understanding the full scope of what was happening to the Apache tribes. "But there is a third path," Joseph continued. "One that requires us to do something that has never been attempted before. It requires us to forge an alliance that bridges the gap between our world and yours." Daniel Storm Wolf stepped forward, understanding that the moment had come to explain the full complexity of their proposal. His voice was quieter than Joseph's but carried equal authority. "In Apache law, there exists an ancient provision that allows a woman who has proven her worth as a warrior and provider to be offered marriage by any Apache man who respects her abilities, regardless of her tribal origin. The law exists to prevent the loss of valuable skills and knowledge." Rebecca's mind raced as she began to understand the direction of their conversation. The practical part of her that had kept her alive for 8 years appreciated the strategic elegance of what they were suggesting, while another part struggled to process the personal implications. "You're proposing marriage," she said slowly. "But not just marriage. You're proposing that I become Apache." "Yes," Joseph replied. "A marriage that would make you legally Apache according to our law, and potentially recognized as such by territorial authorities. A union that would allow you to represent our interests in negotiations with whites, to own land in your name that could serve as a sanctuary for our people, to act as a bridge between 2 worlds that have known only conflict." Robert Iron Bear, the tracker, spoke for the first time. "We are not asking you to pretend to be something you are not. We are asking you to become something new, a woman who belongs fully to both worlds and can help create understanding between them." The audacity of the proposal left Rebecca momentarily speechless. These 6 men were asking her to abandon the solitary life She had built and joined them in creating something that had never existed before, a marriage that would be simultaneously personal and political, a union designed to serve the survival needs of an entire people. "Which of you," she asked finally, "would be proposing this marriage?" The question hung in the air as the 6 warriors exchanged glances. It was Michael Thunderhorse who answered, his youthful directness cutting through the diplomatic complexity of the moment. "Any of us would be honored to be chosen," he said simply. "We came here together because the decision should be yours. If you agree to consider our proposal, you should choose your husband based on your own judgment of character and compatibility, not on arrangements made by others." Rebecca studied each man's face in the lamplight, seeing not just the obvious physical differences, but the distinct personalities that marked each as an individual. Joseph's natural authority and the weight of leadership he carried. Daniel's thoughtful intelligence and obvious loyalty to his friend. Robert's patient intensity and deep connection to the land. Michael's youthful energy and honest directness. Samuel's strategic mind and mature wisdom. David's diplomatic skills and cultural knowledge. "You're asking me to choose a husband from among 6 men I've just met," she said, not without a touch of irony. "And to join a people I've only encountered from a distance. And to become part of a political alliance that could start a war if it goes wrong." Samuel Broken Arrow, the eldest and most experienced in negotiations, recognized the need to address her concerns directly. "What we are asking is unprecedented," he acknowledged. "But so is your situation. You have already chosen to live according to principles that most whites would consider impossible. You have proven that you can thrive in circumstances that would break most people. We are asking you to apply that same courage and practical wisdom to a challenge that could benefit all our peoples." David Red Eagle added his diplomatic perspective. "We are not asking for an immediate decision. Such a choice requires time for proper consideration. We ask only that you allow us to remain in your valley for several days so that you can observe us as we have observed you. Learn who we are as individuals, understand what kind of life we could offer, and decide whether this alliance serves your own interests as well as ours." Rebecca realized that she was facing the most important decision of her life, one that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the fate of an entire people. The logical part of her mind cataloged the enormous risks marrying a virtual stranger, joining a culture she didn't fully understand, becoming a target for both military authorities and hostile settlers. But another part of her, the part that had chosen to remain alone in the desert rather than retreat to civilization, was intrigued by the challenge these men presented. For 8 years, she had proven herself capable of surviving anything the wilderness could offer. Now they were asking her to prove herself capable of something even more difficult, building bridges between worlds that had been at war for generations. "You mentioned that your scouts have been observing me," she said. "I assume that means you know something about my abilities. But I know nothing about yours beyond reputation and rumor. If I'm going to consider this proposal seriously, I need to understand what kind of men you are and what kind of life you're offering." Joseph nodded approvingly. The practical nature of her response confirmed everything their scouts had reported about her character. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "Your skills, your values, your plans for this alliance you're proposing. Your expectations of a wife, your understanding of partnership, your vision of how this arrangement would actually work in practice. If you're asking me to bet my life on your character, I want to understand exactly what that bet involves." Michael Thunderhorse grinned at her directness. "She doesn't ask for much, does she?" "She asks for exactly what any intelligent person would ask for," Daniel observed. "Complete honesty about what we're proposing and who we are as men." Rebecca looked around at the 6 faces watching her in the lamplight, each marked by years of hardship and conflict, each carrying the burden of their people's survival. These were not men who made casual decisions or entered into agreements lightly. The very fact that they had come here together, violating every tradition of Apache warfare and diplomacy, spoke to their desperation and their courage. "There's a stream about a quarter-mile east of here with good grazing for your horses," she said finally. "You can make camp there. Tomorrow we'll begin the conversations that will determine whether this impossible idea of yours has any chance of becoming reality." As the warriors began to lead their horses toward the indicated camping area, Joseph lingered for a moment. "Rebecca Hayes," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something before we begin these discussions. What we are proposing is not a business arrangement or a diplomatic convenience. Apache marriage is a sacred bond that creates real obligations and genuine partnership. Whoever you might choose as a husband would be committing to love and protect you as completely as you would be committing to our people's welfare." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Crowfeather, I've spent 8 years learning that the most important decisions in life are the ones that scare you most. This proposal terrifies me in ways I'm still trying to understand, but it also offers possibilities I never imagined. We'll see which feeling proves stronger." As she watched the 6 warriors disappear into the darkness toward their camping place, Rebecca realized that her 8 years of solitude had been preparing her for this moment without her knowing it. She had learned to make life and death decisions based on careful observation and sound judgment. She had proven her ability to adapt to circumstances that would overwhelm most people. Now she faced the ultimate test of those abilities, deciding whether to join her life to that of a people fighting for their very survival, and choosing which of 6 remarkable men would become her partner in an alliance that could change the future of the American Southwest. Dawn came early to the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Rebecca Hayes had slept poorly, her mind churning with the implications of the previous evening's conversation. As she stepped onto her porch with her morning coffee, she could see smoke rising from the Apache camp by the stream, evidence that her unexpected guests were already awake and preparing for what promised to be an extraordinary day. What she hadn't expected was to find Daniel Storm Wolf sitting motionless on a boulder 50 yards from her cabin, positioned where he could observe both her home and the approaches to the valley. He had been there since before dawn, she realized, serving as a silent sentinel while his companions slept. When he noticed her watching him, he raised his hand in a brief greeting but made no move to approach, understanding that she might need time to process what had happened the night before. Rebecca finished her coffee and began her morning routine, acutely aware that she was being observed by men whose very lives might depend on their assessment of her character. She fed her chickens with the same efficient movements she'd used for 8 years, checked her small vegetable garden for signs of pest damage, and inspected the harness she'd been mending when the warriors arrived. Every action felt weighted with significance, knowing that these men were evaluating her competence just as she would soon be evaluating theirs. By the time the sun had fully risen, all 6 Apache warriors had appeared at various points around her homestead, not intruding, but making themselves visible and available. It was, Rebecca realized, a carefully orchestrated demonstration of respect. They were showing her that they understood this was her territory while also making it clear they were ready to engage when she was. Joseph Crowfeather approached first, moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to leadership. "Good morning, Rebecca Hayes. I hope our presence here hasn't disturbed your rest." "I've had more restful nights," she admitted honestly, "but probably not more important ones. How does this process work? I've never been courted by 6 men simultaneously, let alone 6 Apache warriors with the fate of their people hanging in the balance." Joseph's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Nor have we ever courted a white woman whose decision could determine our survival. We are all walking new ground here." But perhaps we should begin with the practical matters you mentioned last night. You said you wanted to understand our skills and our values. May I suggest we demonstrate rather than simply describe? Rebecca nodded, intrigued by the directness of his approach. What did you have in mind? Your valley provides good hunting, Joseph observed. Winter is coming, and you will need meat to preserve for the cold months. Allow us to hunt with you today. See how we work together, how we approach challenges, how we treat the animals we take, and the land we use. Our actions will tell you more about our character than our words ever could. It was a practical suggestion that appealed to Rebecca's sensibilities. She had always believed that a person's true nature revealed itself most clearly under pressure. And hunting in the high desert required exactly the kind of skills and judgment that would be crucial in a marriage partner. Agreed, she said, but I have conditions. This is my territory, so we hunt by my rules. We take only what we can use, we waste nothing, and we leave no trace of our passage except the animals we harvest. Can your men accept that? Those are Apache rules as much as yours, Daniel Storm-Wolf replied, having approached while they were talking. We would be disappointed if you expected anything less. The hunting expedition that followed became an intricate dance of skill and character revelation that taught Rebecca more about her potential suitors than hours of conversation could have accomplished. Each man's approach to the challenge revealed fundamental aspects of his personality and capabilities. Robert Iron Bear, the tracker, took the lead in finding game, reading signs in the desert terrain with an almost supernatural ability. Rebecca watched him examine disturbed sand, broken vegetation, and scattered stones, building a narrative of animal movement that was so detailed it seemed like magic. But when she asked questions about his methods, he answered with the patient precision of a teacher, showing her subtleties she had never noticed despite her own considerable tracking skills. See here, he said, pointing to what looked like unmarked ground. The pebbles are pressed deeper on this side, pushed by the weight of something moving downhill. And this grass blade is bent against its natural growth pattern, something large, brushed against it within the last day. Rebecca found herself genuinely impressed by his expertise, but more importantly, she was struck by his willingness to share knowledge rather than hoard it as a source of personal power. It suggested a generosity of spirit that would be crucial in any partnership. Michael Thunderhorse demonstrated his marksmanship when they finally located a small herd of deer in a canyon 3 miles from Rebecca's homestead. The shot he made taking down a prime buck at nearly 200 yards, with a rifle that looked older than he was, would have been impressive from any marksman. But what caught Rebecca's attention was what happened afterward. Instead of celebrating his skill or boasting about the difficulty of the shot, Michael immediately began the practical work of field dressing the animal, his movements quick and efficient. He worked with obvious respect for the life he had taken, murmuring what Rebecca assumed was a prayer of gratitude in his native language. When she asked about it later, he explained simply, "The deer gave its life to sustain ours. The least we can do is acknowledge that gift." Samuel Broken Arrow revealed his strategic mind by organizing the transportation of their harvest back to the homestead. What could have been a chaotic effort by 6 men carrying meat and equipment across difficult terrain became a carefully coordinated operation under his direction. He assessed each person's strengths, assigned tasks accordingly, and established a route that minimized effort while maximizing safety. But his leadership style impressed Rebecca even more than his organizational skills. Rather than simply issuing orders, Samuel explained his reasoning and invited suggestions for improvement. When Rebecca pointed out a more efficient way to secure the meat for transport, he immediately incorporated her suggestion and thanked her for the insight. David Red Eagle's diplomatic nature emerged during a tense moment when they encountered a group of Mexican vaqueros driving cattle through the area. The cowboys were clearly nervous about meeting Apache warriors, their hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons as the two groups faced each other across a narrow valley. David stepped forward and addressed the vaqueros in fluent Spanish, his tone calm and respectful. Rebecca couldn't follow the entire conversation, but she could see the tension gradually ease as David explained their presence and assured the cowboys they meant no harm. By the end of the exchange, the vaqueros were actually sharing information about water sources and recent Apache activity in the region. "How many languages do you speak?" Rebecca asked as they continued their journey home. "4 well, 3 adequately," David replied without boasting. "Apache, Spanish, English, and some Navajo. A little Mexican border dialect and enough army slang to follow military conversations. In my experience, most conflicts begin with misunderstanding. And most misunderstandings come from people who can't talk to each other properly." Joseph Crowfeather's leadership qualities were evident throughout the entire expedition, but they manifested in ways that surprised Rebecca. Rather than dominating every decision or asserting his authority through commands, Joseph seemed to function as a coordinator who brought out the best in each of his companions. He deferred to Robert's tracking expertise, supported Samuel's organizational efforts, and backed David's diplomatic interventions without ever appearing to diminish his own authority. Most impressively, he treated Rebecca as a full partner in the expedition rather than a guest to be protected or impressed. When she suggested an alternative route that would avoid disturbing the hawk's nesting area, he not only accepted her recommendation but asked thoughtful questions about local wildlife patterns that demonstrated genuine interest in her knowledge. Hunting trip also revealed how the 6 men functioned as a unit. Rebecca had expected to see the kind of rigid military hierarchy that characterized army patrols, but instead she observed something more like a family of brothers who had learned to work together through years of shared hardship. They anticipated each other's needs, communicated through subtle gestures and expressions, and supported each other's strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. But perhaps most tellingly, Rebecca noticed how they treated her presence among them. There was no condescension, no protective hovering, no assumption that she needed special consideration because of her gender. They simply accepted her as a capable partner and adjusted their normal patterns to include her contributions naturally. By the time they returned to the homestead in late afternoon, Rebecca had learned more about these 6 men than she had about most people she'd known for years. The hunting expedition had stripped away the formal diplomacy of the previous evening and revealed the practical reality of who they were when focused on immediate challenges. As they worked together to preserve the meat they had harvested, Rebecca found herself evaluating not just their individual qualities, but how each man might function as a partner in the kind of life she had built for herself. The isolation that had defined her existence for 8 years suddenly seemed less like a necessity and more like a limitation she had imposed on herself. But the hunting trip had also raised new questions about the complexity of what the Apache warriors were proposing. Watching them work together with such seamless coordination made Rebecca wonder how any marriage between her and one of them would affect the dynamics of their brotherhood. Would choosing one of them create resentment or division among the others? Could the political alliance they envisioned survive the personal complications that such an arrangement would inevitably create? As evening approached and the practical work of the day gave way to the social interactions of shared meals and conversation, Rebecca realized that her evaluation of these men was becoming more complex and more personal than she had anticipated. Each of them had proven himself worthy of respect in different ways, but the question of which one might become her husband was beginning to feel less like a strategic decision and more like a matter of the heart. The challenge she faced was unlike anything in her experience: how to choose a life partner from among 6 remarkable men while also deciding whether to abandon the independence she had fought so hard to achieve and join a people whose survival might depend on her decision. That evening, As she sat on her porch watching the Apache warriors tend their camp by the stream, Rebecca Hayes understood that the next few days would test not just their character, but her own courage in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The third evening of the Apache warriors' stay brought with it an unexpected crisis that would test every assumption Rebecca Hayes had made about her potential suitors and force her to confront the true complexity of the alliance they were proposing. It began with the sound every desert dweller feared most, the distant rumble of approaching horses in the darkness. Too many riders moving too fast to be anything but trouble. Rebecca emerged from her cabin to find the 6 Apache warriors already in defensive positions around her homestead, their weapons ready and their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the approaching threat. "How many?" she asked Joseph Crow, Feather, who had taken position near her porch where he could coordinate with his men while protecting her cabin. 20, maybe 25, he replied grimly. "Moving hard from the southwest. Could be army patrol, could be civilian militia. Either way, they're not coming for a social visit." Rebecca felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. She had always known that her isolated existence made her vulnerable to various threats, but she had managed to avoid serious trouble through careful planning and sheer luck. Tonight, it seemed, her luck had run out at the worst possible time. "There. Probably looking for you," she said, understanding immediately that the presence of 6 Apache warriors in her valley had likely been reported by the Mexican vaqueros they had encountered during the hunting expedition. "If they find you here, they'll assume I'm either your prisoner or your accomplice." Daniel Storm Wolf appeared beside them, moving with the silent efficiency that had made him such an effective scout. "We can be gone in 10 minutes, he said. "Quietly. Disappear into the rocks above the valley. They'll never find us in the darkness." Rebecca's mind raced through the implications. If the Apache warriors fled and she was found alone, she might be able to convince the approaching riders that she had seen nothing unusual. But if they discovered evidence of the Apache camp, or if someone had already reported seeing warriors in her valley, her denials would be worthless. Worse, abandoning the warriors now would effectively end any possibility of the alliance they had proposed. "No," she said firmly. "If you run now, you'll be admitting guilt for crimes you haven't committed. And I'll be left to face questions I can't answer convincingly." Joseph studied her face in the moonlight, seeing determination where he had expected fear. "What are you suggesting?" Rebecca's response surprised even herself. "I'm suggesting we face this together, as a family." The word hung in the air with sudden significance. In the space of 3 days, Rebecca had moved from considering the Apache proposal as an abstract diplomatic arrangement to thinking of these men as potential family members. The realization shocked her with its implications. Michael Thunderhorse understood immediately what she was proposing. "You want to claim marriage to one of us. Right now, before they arrive." "It's the only story that makes sense," Rebecca replied, her practical mind working through the scenario rapidly. A woman living alone invites attack and suspicion. A woman with an Apache husband and his brothers visiting for negotiations. That's unusual, but not necessarily hostile. Samuel Broken Arrow raised the obvious complication. Which husband? And how do we make it convincing on such short notice? The approaching horses were getting closer, their riders clearly heading directly for Rebecca's homestead. There was no time for lengthy deliberation or careful consideration of compatibility. Rebecca looked at the 6 men who had risked everything to propose an alliance with her, understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate safety, but the entire future of their relationship. Her gaze settled on Joseph Crow Feather, the war chief whose leadership had brought them to her valley and whose authority would be most likely to command respect from hostile whites. But more than that, she chose him because in 3 days of observation, he had proven himself to be a man whose strength was matched by his intelligence, whose authority was tempered by genuine respect for others. "Joseph," she said simply, "if you're willing." The formality of Apache marriage customs would normally require elaborate ceremonies and extended negotiations between families. But Apache law also recognized emergency unions contracted under extraordinary circumstances, and nothing about their situation was ordinary. Joseph Crow Feather stepped forward and took Rebecca's hands in his own, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the approach in danger seem suddenly secondary. "Rebecca Hayes, will you accept me as your husband according to Apache law and stand with me as we face whatever comes?" "I will," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Joseph Crow Feather, I accept you as my husband and pledge to honor the alliance we are creating." It was the simplest and most rushed wedding ceremony in the history of either culture, but the words carried weight that transcended their hasty circumstances. In that moment, Rebecca Hayes became an Apache wife, and Joseph Crow Feather gained a partner whose courage matched his own. The approaching riders arrived less than 10 minutes later, their horses blowing hard from the rapid journey across difficult terrain. Rebecca counted 23 men, a mix of army cavalry and civilian militia, all armed and clearly expecting trouble. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant with 30 years of frontier experience, dismounted and approached the cabin with his hand resting on his sidearm. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, recognizing her despite the unusual circumstances. "Sergeant Patrick Murphy, Fort Verde. We received reports of Apache activity in this area. Are you all right?" Rebecca stepped forward with Joseph beside her, noting how the sergeant's eyes widened at the sight of 6 Apache warriors positioned defensively around her homestead. "I'm fine, Sergeant Murphy. These men are here by invitation." "Invitation?" Murphy's voice carried obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, these are hostile Apache warriors. They're wanted for raids on military supplies and attacks on civilian settlements." Joseph spoke for the first time, his English formal but clear. "Sergeant, I am Joseph Crow Feather of the Tonto Apache. I am here to discuss peace terms with my wife and her people." The word "wife" hit the assembled soldiers and militia like a physical blow. Several men reached for their weapons before Murphy raised his hand to maintain order. "Your wife?" "Ma'am, is this true?" Rebecca felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Her answer would determine not just their immediate safety, the entire future of Apache-white relations in the territory. "Yes, Sergeant. Joseph Crow Feather is my husband according to Apache law. We were married 3 days ago." Murphy stared at her as if she had announced her intention to sprout wings and fly. "Ma'am, you've married a hostile Indian. A man responsible for the deaths of American soldiers and civilians. I've married a man who is trying to find an alternative to the war that's destroying both our peoples," Rebecca replied firmly. "A man who came here seeking peace rather than violence." The tension around the homestead was thick enough to cut with a knife. 23 armed men faced 6 Apache warriors across Rebecca's small yard, while she stood between them trying to prevent a massacre that would destroy everything they had worked to build. David, Red Eagle, recognized the diplomatic opportunity and stepped forward carefully. "Sergeant, we are here under a flag of truce to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict between our peoples. The marriage between my brother and Mrs. Hayes creates a legal bond that could serve as the foundation for a lasting peace treaty." Murphy looked around at his men, seeing the skepticism and hostility in their faces. Many of them had lost friends to Apache raids and were in no mood for negotiation. "That's above my authority," he said finally. "I'll need to report this to my commanding officer." "Report what, Sergeant?" Rebecca asked pointedly. "That you found a legally married couple and 5 family members visiting them peacefully? Or that you discovered Apache warriors willing to negotiate instead of fight?" The sergeant was clearly struggling with a situation that fell far outside his normal experience. Military protocol demanded that he arrest or eliminate Apache warriors found in the territory, but the presence of a white woman claiming marriage to their leader complicated everything. Robert Iron Bear had been scanning the surrounding terrain while the conversation continued, and he suddenly moved closer to Joseph. "More riders coming," he said quietly, "from the east. Different group." Murphy heard the warning and immediately ordered his men into defensive positions. "How many?" "8, maybe 10, Robert replied, moving cautious like they're trying to avoid being seen. The new arrivals proved to be a group of civilian ranchers led by a man Rebecca recognized with a sinking heart, William Crawford, a wealthy cattle baron whose operations had been repeatedly targeted by Apache raids. Crawford was known throughout the territory for his hatred of all Native Americans and his belief that the only solution to the Indian problem was complete extermination. Crawford dismounted and surveyed the scene with obvious fury. "Murphy, what the hell is going on here? Why haven't you arrested these savages?" "Mr. Crawford, the situation is complicated," Murphy began, but Crawford cut him off. "Complicated? I see 6 Apache warriors and 23 American soldiers. The only complication I see is why these Indians are still breathing." Rebecca stepped forward, understanding that Crawford's presence had just made their situation infinitely more dangerous. "Mr. Crawford, these men are here under a flag of truce. They're my guests." Crawford's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Your guests? Rebecca, these animals killed my brother and burned out 3 of my line camps last month. They're not guests, they're murderers." The accusation hit the Apache warriors like a physical blow. Joseph's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "William Crawford, I know of your brother's death. It was not done by my people. You're calling me a liar, you red-skinned devil?" Crawford's hand moved to his gun. The situation was spiraling toward violence with terrifying speed. Rebecca realized that everything they had worked to build over the past 3 days was about to be destroyed by old hatred and mutual mistrust. But she also understood that this moment would define not just their immediate survival, but the entire future of the alliance they were trying to create. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying across the tense gathering with surprising authority. "All of you, just stop and listen." The power in her words came not from volume, but from the desperate sincerity of someone fighting to prevent a tragedy. "Mr. Crawford, I'm sorry for your loss. The death of your brother was a terrible thing. But killing these men won't bring him back, and it will guarantee that this cycle of violence continues forever." She turned to address the assembled soldiers and ranchers. "You came here expecting to find raiders and hostiles. Instead, you found people trying to build something new. A bridge between our peoples that could end the bloodshed that's destroyed so many families on both sides." Crawford spat in the dust. "Pretty words, Rebecca. But words don't stop bullets or bring back the dead." "No," Joseph said quietly, speaking for the first time since Crawford's arrival. "But they can prevent future deaths. Your brother died because our peoples have forgotten how to see each other as human beings. My wife and I are trying to remember." The word wife from Joseph's lips carried a weight that even Crawford couldn't ignore. The reality of their marriage, hastily contracted though it was, had created a new dynamic that none of the gathered men knew how to handle. In that moment of tense silence, with 33 armed men facing each other across her small homestead, Rebecca Hayes understood that her choice of Joseph Crowfeather as a husband had been about much more than personal compatibility. She had chosen the one man whose authority and presence might be strong enough to hold the fragile peace they were trying to build. The question now was whether that choice would be enough to prevent the massacre that seemed only moments away. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the arrival of an unexpected witness whose testimony would change everything. As tensions reached their breaking point, with Crawford's hand on his gun and the Apache warriors preparing for what seemed like inevitable violence, The sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop cut through the night air. The rider who emerged from the darkness was Maria Santos, a Mexican woman whose small ranch lay 15 miles south of Rebecca's homestead. But Maria was more than just another settler. She was the widow of a man killed in an Apache raid 2 years earlier, and her hatred for the warriors should have made her a natural ally for Crawford's violent solution. Instead, she dismounted her lathered horse and walked directly toward the center of the confrontation, her weathered face grim with purpose. "Senator Crawford," she said in heavily accented English, "before you do something that cannot be undone, there is something you must know about your brother's death." Crawford's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Maria, this isn't your business. These savages, these warriors did not kill your brother," Maria interrupted firmly. "I know this because I saw who did." The statement hit the assembled men like a thunderclap. Crawford stared at the Mexican woman as if she had struck him physically. "What are you talking about?" "Apache raiders hit my line camp." "See, raiders hit your camp," Maria agreed, "but they were not Apache. They were white men dressed as Indians, trying to make it look like tribal warfare." The revelation sent a murmur of shock through the gathered soldiers and ranchers. Sergeant Murphy stepped forward, his military training demanding verification of such an explosive claim. "Mrs. Santos, that's a serious accusation. Are you certain of what you're saying?" Maria reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch, which she handed to Murphy. "I found this at the scene of your brother's death, Senator Crawford. Look inside." Crawford snatched the pouch and emptied its contents into his palm. What spilled out was a collection of items that made his face go white: a military-issue pocket watch, 2 brass buttons from a cavalry uniform, and a silver ring bearing the initials Team. "Thomas Morrison," Crawford whispered, recognizing the ring immediately. "But he's the man who led the fake Apache raid," Maria said quietly. "I saw him and his gang changing out of their Indian disguises after they burned your line camp. They thought no one was watching, but I was tracking cattle thieves in the area." Murphy examined the evidence with growing understanding. "Morrison was drummed out of the army for selling weapons to hostiles. We've been hunting him for months." The implications of Maria's revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. If Crawford's brother had been killed by white criminals disguised as Apache, then the cycle of revenge that had brought them to this confrontation was based on a lie. The raids that had inflamed anti-Apache sentiment throughout the territory might not have been Apache raids at all. Crawford stared at the evidence in his hands, his worldview crumbling around him. For months, his hatred had focused on the Apache warriors he believed had murdered his brother. Now he was learning that the real killers were white men who had deliberately tried to start a war between settlers and tribes. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Crawford asked Maria, his voice hollow with shock. Maria's expression hardened. "Because who would believe a Mexican widow? And because I wanted to be sure before I accused anyone of such terrible crimes. I have been following Morrison's gang, gathering proof." She turned to address the entire gathering. "These false flag attacks have been happening for months. White criminals dress as Indians, attack settlements, then disappear while the army hunts innocent tribes. It is a scheme to start a war that will drive all Native Americans from their land so that Morrison and his backers can claim it for themselves." "David." Red Eagle stepped forward carefully, understanding the diplomatic opportunity that Maria's testimony had created. "This is exactly why we came here, seeking peace instead of war. Too many conflicts begin with misunderstandings and lies spread by people who profit from violence." Sergeant Murphy was struggling to process the full implications of what he was hearing. "Mrs. Santos, do you have evidence of other false attacks?" "See, I have been keeping records." Maria gestured toward her saddlebag. "Dates, locations, descriptions of the real attackers. Morrison's gang has been very busy creating reasons for the army to hunt Apache. The revelation was transforming the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Men who had arrived ready to fight Apache warriors were now grappling with the possibility that they had been manipulated by criminals whose goal was to create exactly this kind of violence. But Crawford wasn't ready to abandon his hatred so easily. Even if Morrison killed my brother, that doesn't make these Indians innocent. They've raided settlements, killed civilians. Have we? Joseph Crowfeather asked quietly. Or have we been blamed for crimes committed by men like Morrison? Well, we tried to survive on land that keeps shrinking around us. Samuel Broken Arrow recognized the moment as a crucial turning point in negotiations. Sergeant Murphy, we propose something unprecedented. Allow us to work with your army to hunt down Morrison's gang. Apache scouts can track these criminals more effectively than cavalry patrols, and bringing them to justice will prove that cooperation between our peoples is possible. It was a bold suggestion that could revolutionize the relationship between the Apache and territorial authorities. Instead of being hunted as enemies, the warriors would become allies in tracking down the real criminals who had been terrorizing the territory. Murphy looked around at his men, seeing uncertainty where there had been certainty just minutes before. That would require authorization from my commanding officer, and it would mean trusting Apache warriors to work alongside Army personnel. It would mean trusting your wife's people, Rebecca said pointedly, reminding everyone present that her marriage to Joseph had created legal and social bonds that couldn't be easily dismissed. Michael, Thunder Horse, added his voice to the proposal. We know Morrison's methods, his hiding places, his escape routes. He uses Apache tactics because he learned them from traders who sold our secrets. We can anticipate his movements in ways that cavalry patrols cannot. The practical benefits of the arrangement were obvious to everyone present. The army had been chasing Morrison's gang for months without success, while the Apache warriors possessed exactly the skills needed to track criminals who were using their own techniques against them. But Robert, Iron Bear, had been scanning the horizon while the conversation continued, and he suddenly tensed with alarm. More riders coming, he announced. Many more. From multiple directions. The ominous news sent a ripple of fear through the gathered men. If Morrison's gang had learned about the confrontation at Rebecca's homestead, they might be moving to eliminate the witnesses who could expose their crimes. How many? Murphy demanded, immediately shifting into military mode. 40, maybe 50, Robert replied grimly. Surrounding the valley. They're not trying to hide their approach. Crawford felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized the implications. Morrison knows we're here. He's coming to silence Maria before she can testify against him. The irony of the situation was staggering. The men who had arrived ready to fight each other now faced a common enemy who threatened all of them equally. Morrison's gang had no loyalty to white settlers or Apache warriors. They were criminals who would kill anyone who threatened to expose their operations. Joseph assessed their tactical situation with the quick efficiency of an experienced war. Chief, we're outnumbered and caught in the open. But we have defensive advantages if we work together. Together? One of Crawford's ranchers asked skeptically. You want us to fight alongside Indians? I want us to fight alongside each other, Rebecca said firmly. Apache, Army, ranchers, all of us united against the criminals who have been playing us against each other for their own profit. Maria Santos nodded emphatically. Senora Hayes is right. Morrison's gang is the enemy of all honest people. They have been laughing at us while we fight each other instead of hunting them. The approaching sound of multiple horse groups converging on their position made the decision urgent. Within minutes, they would be under attack by a force that outnumbered them nearly 2-1. Their only chance of survival lay in combining their strengths and fighting as a unified force. Sergeant Murphy made the command decision that would either save them all or doom them to destruction. All right, we fight together. Apache warriors, Can your men coordinate with cavalry tactics? Daniel Stormwolf answered immediately. We've been fighting cavalry for years. We know your methods better than you think. Samuel Broken Arrow was already analyzing their defensive options. The cabin provides cover for civilians. The barn offers an elevated position for riflemen. The creek bed gives us protected movement. Between positions, Michael Thunder Horse added his assessment. Morrison's men are good with guns, but poor with strategy. They rely on overwhelming force and intimidation. If we can hold them off long enough, they'll make mistakes. The next 20 minutes transformed Rebecca's peaceful homestead into a fortress manned by the most unlikely alliance in the history of the American West. Apache warriors took positions alongside cavalry soldiers, ranchers worked with tribal scouts, and a Mexican widow found herself defending the very people she had once considered enemies. Rebecca and Maria were placed in the cabin with instructions to tend wounded and maintain communication between the various defensive positions. As the sound of approaching attackers grew louder, Rebecca realized that her marriage to Joseph Crow Feather had accomplished something she never could have imagined. It had created the foundation for a genuine alliance between peoples who had been enemies for generations. The test of that alliance was about to begin. In the darkness beyond her homestead, Morrison's gang was preparing to attack a force they expected to find divided and hostile to each other. Instead, they would face a united defense that combined the tactical knowledge of Apache warriors with the firepower of cavalry soldiers and the desperate courage of settlers fighting for their homes. The battle that was about to begin would determine not just their immediate survival, but whether the bridge Rebecca and Joseph had started building between their peoples could withstand the violence that had kept them apart for so long. As the first shots rang out in the desert night, Rebecca Hayes understood that she was no longer fighting just for her own life, but for the future of everyone who believed that cooperation could triumph over conflict, and that understanding could overcome generations of mistrust and hatred. Attack came at midnight, when darkness would give Morrison's gang the advantage of surprise and confusion. But what they encountered instead was a coordinated defense that combined Apache stealth with military precision in ways that none of the attackers had ever faced before. The first indication that something had gone wrong with Morrison's plan came when his advance scouts simply vanished. Robert Iron Bear and 3 cavalry troopers had eliminated the reconnaissance team so quietly that the main force had no warning their approach had been detected. The Apache tracker's ability to move silently through terrain he had studied for days, combined with the soldiers' disciplined marksmanship, proved devastatingly effective. Thomas Morrison himself led the main assault, a bear of a man whose scarred face and missing left eye spoke of a lifetime of violence. He had built his criminal operation on the assumption that whites and Apache would never cooperate, that their mutual hatred could be manipulated indefinitely to provide cover for his activities. The sight of soldiers and warriors fighting side by side shattered his worldview as completely as it destroyed his tactical plans. What the hell is going on here? Morrison roared as his initial charge met coordinated resistance from positions that should have been fighting each other instead of his men. They're supposed to be killing each other, not us. His lieutenant, a thin man named Jake Williams, whose expertise lay in creating false evidence of Apache raids, tried to make sense of the tactical situation they faced. "Boss, there's Apache in the barn working with cavalry. Civilians taking orders from Indian scouts. It's like they planned this together." Morrison's fury at seeing his carefully constructed deceptions exposed was matched by his shock at encountering organized resistance. For months, his gang had relied on attacking isolated targets, lone homesteads, small outposts, traveling merchants who couldn't fight back effectively. Now they faced a mixed force that anticipated their tactics and countered them with devastating precision. The barn that Samuel Broken Arrow had identified as a key defensive position became the anchor of their resistance. Michael Thunder Horse and 4 cavalry soldiers had positioned themselves in the loft, where their elevated angle gave them clear fields of fire across the entire homestead. The young Apache's supernatural marksmanship combined with the soldiers' military training created a killing zone that Morrison's men couldn't cross. But it was the coordination between Apache and Army fighters that proved most effective. Daniel Stormwolf moved through the darkness like a ghost, appearing behind enemy positions to eliminate sentries and disrupt communications, while cavalry troopers provided covering fire and maintained defensive lines. The combination of Apache stealth and military firepower was something Morrison's gang had no preparation for. Inside the cabin, Rebecca and Maria worked frantically to tend wounded fighters from both sides, their makeshift medical station becoming a symbol of the cooperation that was developing under fire. When a cavalry trooper took a bullet in the shoulder, Maria used techniques learned from Apache medicine women to stop the bleeding. When David Red Eagle was grazed by a ricochet, Rebecca applied bandages with the same care she would have given any family member. "How is it possible?" Maria asked as she worked to stabilize a wounded rancher. "Yesterday, these men were ready to kill each other, and tonight they fight like brothers." Rebecca looked out the window where she could see Joseph coordinating the defense with Sergeant Murphy, their different approaches to warfare blending seamlessly. "Sometimes it takes a common enemy to help people remember what they have in common," she replied. The turning point in the battle came when Morrison attempted to use fire as a weapon, ordering his men to shoot flaming arrows into the cabin and barn. It was a tactic he had used before while disguised as Apache, knowing that frontier buildings were vulnerable to flame and that firefighting would break up defensive positions. But Robert Iron Bear had anticipated this move, and the defenders were ready. As soon as the first fire arrows appeared, a coordinated firefighting effort began that showcased the best of both cultures' survival skills. Apache warriors used traditional methods to smother flames with dirt and sand, while soldiers organized bucket brigades from the creek. Ranchers who knew their building's weak points directed efforts to protect structural timbers, while Maria used her knowledge of desert plants to create flame-retardant barriers. The sight of Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers working together to save civilian buildings infuriated Morrison beyond reason. His entire criminal enterprise depended on maintaining hatred between whites and Native Americans. Every act of cooperation between former enemies threatened to expose the lies his operation was built on. "Kill them all," he screamed at his remaining men. "I don't care if they're working together, they're all dead if we don't shut them up." But Morrison's desperation was leading him to make tactical errors that the experienced fighters defending the homestead could exploit. When he ordered a direct assault on the cabin where Rebecca and Maria were tending wounded, he exposed his men to crossfire from positions they hadn't detected. Joseph Crow Feather had positioned himself where he could observe the entire battlefield, and he recognized Morrison's mistake immediately. Using hand signals that cavalry soldiers had quickly learned to interpret, he coordinated a counterattack that caught the criminals in the open ground between the cabin and their own cover. The result was devastating. Morrison's gang, which had seemed so formidable when approaching the homestead, found themselves caught in a carefully planned trap executed by men who had learned to trust each other's abilities completely. Apache mobility and Army firepower combined to create tactical advantages that neither side could have achieved alone. Within an hour of beginning his attack, Morrison found himself in command of fewer than 20 men, trapped in a defensive position with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The realization that his carefully planned assault had become a disaster hit him like a physical blow. "We need to get out of here," Jake Williams urged, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "These aren't the same people we've been fighting. They know what they're doing." But Morrison's pride and desperation made retreat impossible to accept. He had built his reputation on overwhelming force and intimidation, and admitting defeat to a mixed group of soldiers and warriors would destroy his authority over his remaining men. "We finish this," he declared. "All of them die tonight, or we lose everything." It was a decision that would prove fatal to his criminal enterprise. Instead of cutting his losses and escaping with his remaining followers, Morrison chose to make a final desperate assault that would expose him personally to the defenders who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. The climactic moment of the battle came when Morrison himself led a charge toward the cabin, apparently believing that killing Rebecca would somehow break the alliance that had formed around her marriage to Joseph. It was a tactical blunder that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what he was facing. Rebecca wasn't just a symbol of Apache white cooperation. She had become the heart of a genuine partnership between peoples who had discovered they could accomplish more together than apart. Her death wouldn't have broken their alliance. It would have strengthened their resolve to build something lasting from the foundation she and Joseph had created. But Morrison never got the chance to test his theory. As he approached the cabin with his remaining men, he found himself facing not just Joseph Crow Feather, but the entire combined force that had been waiting for him to expose himself. The final confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. Morrison's desperate assault met coordinated resistance that had been planned and practiced throughout the night's fighting. Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers moved together with precision that spoke of genuine trust and mutual respect. Ranchers and tribal scouts supported each other with the automatic cooperation of men who had learned to depend on each other's abilities. When the shooting stopped, Thomas Morrison lay dead in Rebecca's yard, his criminal empire destroyed by the very cooperation he had tried so hard to prevent. The fake Apache raids that had terrorized the territory for months were finally exposed, and the real criminals who had been manipulating both sides were either dead or captured. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the unlikely alliance that had defended Rebecca's homestead faced the aftermath of their victory. Soldiers and warriors who had been enemies 12 hours earlier were now sharing water and medical supplies. Ranchers were learning Apache words, while tribal scouts discussed cavalry tactics with obvious interest. Sergeant Murphy surveyed the scene with the wonder of a man who had witnessed something he never thought possible. "In 30 years of frontier service," he told Joseph, "I've never seen anything like this. Whites and Apache fighting together, trusting each other, actually caring about each other's welfare." Joseph's response carried the weight of a man who understood that they had accomplished something far more important than winning a single battle. "Perhaps it is time for new possibilities, Sergeant. Perhaps the old ways of thinking have failed us all." Rebecca stood on her porch, looking out at the evidence of destruction and cooperation that marked her homestead. The buildings were scarred by bullet holes and fire damage, but they had survived. More importantly, the people who had defended them together were already talking about rebuilding, about creating something permanent from the temporary alliance that had saved their lives. Maria Santos approached her with a tired smile. "Senora Hayes, you have done something remarkable here. You have shown that enemies can become family when they face the truth together." As the survivors began the work of cleaning up and counting their losses, Rebecca realized that her 8 years of solitude had been preparing her for this moment without her knowing it. She had learned to see beyond surface differences to underlying character, to value practical ability over social prejudice, to understand that survival often required cooperation with people who seemed different but shared fundamental values. The marriage that had begun as a desperate strategic alliance was becoming something deeper and more genuine with each passing hour. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them all had instead forged bonds that would be difficult to break. But as the sun rose higher and the immediate danger passed, new challenges began to emerge. The success of their alliance would now need to be explained to military commanders, territorial governors, and tribal councils who had never imagined such cooperation was possible. The real test of what Rebecca and Joseph had built together was Just beginning. 3 weeks after the battle that destroyed Morrison's gang, Rebecca and Joseph found themselves facing a different kind of enemy, one that couldn't be defeated with rifles and tactical coordination. The bureaucratic machinery of the territorial government had awakened to the unprecedented alliance that had formed around their marriage, and the response was everything they had feared and more. The first indication of trouble came with the arrival of Colonel Harrison Whitfield, commanding officer of Fort Verde, whose rigid adherence to military protocol had earned him a reputation for crushing anything that deviated from established procedures. Whitfield rode into the valley with a full company of cavalry, their formation precise and intimidating, designed to demonstrate the overwhelming power of federal authority. Unlike Sergeant Murphy, who had witnessed the cooperation between Apache and Army firsthand, Colonel Whitfield had only read reports that contradicted everything he believed about proper relations between whites and Native Americans. His worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers could work together effectively, and he was determined to restore what he considered proper order. "Mrs. Hayes," he announced formally, dismounting from his horse with practiced military bearing. "I am Colonel Whitfield, and I'm here to investigate the highly irregular circumstances surrounding recent events in this area." Rebecca stood on her porch beside Joseph, noting how the colonel's eyes lingered on her Apache husband with obvious disapproval. "Colonel, I assume Sergeant Murphy filed his report about Morrison's gang and how they were brought to justice." "Sergeant Murphy filed a report that reads like fiction," Whitfield replied coldly. "Claims of Apache warriors fighting alongside Army personnel, joint tactical operations, shared intelligence gathering. Such arrangements are not only unauthorized, they're dangerous precedents that threaten the stability of this entire territory." Joseph stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding attention even from men who considered him an enemy. "Colonel, the arrangements you described saved the lives of your soldiers and eliminated criminals who had been terrorizing civilians for months. How is that dangerous?" Whitfield's expression hardened at being addressed directly by an Apache war chief. "Because it legitimizes cooperation with hostiles, normalizes fraternization with enemy combatants, and undermines the clear chain of command that keeps this territory stable." The fundamental disconnect between Whitfield's bureaucratic perspective and the practical reality they had lived through was immediately apparent. The colonel saw their alliance as a violation of proper procedures, while they saw it as proof that cooperation was possible between peoples who had been artificially maintained as enemies. But Whitfield had brought more than just military authority to bear on the situation. Behind his cavalry company rode a civilian delegation that included territorial officials, federal marshals, and representatives from Washington, whose presence indicated that their little alliance had attracted attention. At the highest levels of government, among the civilians was Judge Clarence Morrison, Thomas Morrison's older brother, and a federal judge, whose influence in territorial politics was matched only by his hatred for the Apache who had killed his criminal sibling. Judge Morrison's arrival transformed what might have been a military investigation into a legal proceeding with the power to destroy everything Rebecca and Joseph had built together. "Mrs. Hayes," Judge Morrison announced as he emerged from his official carriage, "you stand accused of providing aid and comfort to enemy combatants, conspiring with hostile Indians to subvert federal authority, and entering into an illegal marriage with a known criminal." The accusations hit Rebecca like physical blows, each charge carefully crafted to criminalize the very cooperation that had saved dozens of lives and brought justice to the territory. "Judge Morrison, your brother was the criminal." "The evidence Maria Santos provided." "Evidence provided by a Mexican national of questionable character," Morrison interrupted. "Evidence that supposedly exonerates the savages who have terrorized this territory for years." How convenient that such evidence appeared just when these Apache needed to clear their names. Daniel Storm Wolf, who had been listening to the exchange with growing anger, stepped forward despite the obvious danger. "Judge Morrison, we have captured 3 of your brother's surviving gang members. They have confessed to the false flag attacks, provided details about how the raids were planned, named their accomplices. Confessions extracted under what circumstances?" Morrison asked with a thin smile. "Confessions obtained by Apache interrogation methods? I hardly think such evidence would stand up in any legitimate court." The legal trap was becoming clear. Morrison and his allies were prepared to dismiss any evidence that contradicted their predetermined conclusion, while using Rebecca's marriage and the Apache alliance as proof of treason and conspiracy. They weren't interested in justice. They wanted to destroy the precedent that cooperation between whites and Apache was possible. Samuel, Broken Arrow, recognized the political dimensions of what they were facing and tried to address them directly. "Judge Morrison, the territorial government has been fighting Apache for decades without achieving lasting peace. We offer an alternative: negotiated settlements, shared responsibility for law enforcement, mutual cooperation against common enemies like your brother's gang." "What you offer," Morrison replied coldly, "is the destruction of everything civilized people have built in this territory. The Apache belong on reservations under federal supervision, not riding free and making alliances with misguided civilians." Colonel Whitfield nodded his agreement. "The Army's position is clear. Military operations cannot be compromised by unauthorized cooperation with hostile forces. The precedent established here, if allowed to stand, would undermine federal authority throughout the Southwest." Rebecca felt the weight of institutional power arraying itself against everything they had accomplished. These men weren't interested in the practical benefits of Apache-white cooperation or the evidence that such alliances could bring peace to the territory. They were protecting a system that required Apache and whites to remain enemies, regardless of the human cost. But the bureaucratic assault on their alliance was interrupted by an unexpected arrival that would complicate the government's plans. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon announced the approach of another large group, and as they drew closer, Rebecca could see that these weren't more government officials. General George Crook, the legendary Indian fighter whose understanding of Apache tactics had made him both feared and respected throughout the Southwest, rode into the valley with a small escort and an expression of intense curiosity. Unlike the other federal officials, Crook had built his reputation on practical results rather than political maneuvering, and his presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Colonel Whitfield," Crook said as he dismounted, his weathered face betraying nothing of his intentions, "I received some interesting reports about recent events in this area. I decided to investigate personally." Whitfield snapped to attention, clearly nervous about explaining the situation to a superior whose views he couldn't predict. "General Crook, we're conducting an investigation into unauthorized cooperation between Army personnel and hostile Apache." "Unauthorized cooperation," Crook repeated thoughtfully, his gaze moving between the assembled officials and the Apache warriors who stood ready for whatever might come. "Tell me, Colonel, what were the results of this unauthorized cooperation, sir?" "The practical results. How many casualties did Morrison's gang inflict during their final attack? How many government personnel were lost? How much property was destroyed?" Whitfield consulted his notes reluctantly. "No military casualties, sir. No civilian deaths among the defenders. Morrison's entire organization was eliminated or captured." Crook's eyebrows rose slightly. "No casualties among our forces. Total elimination of a criminal gang that had been operating successfully for months, and capture of surviving criminals who can provide intelligence about other similar operations. These are the results of unauthorized cooperation." Judge Morrison stepped forward, recognizing that Crook's practical perspective might undermine his legal case. "General, the methods used to achieve these results violated federal law and military protocol. The marriage between Mrs. Hayes and this Apache war chief alone constitutes. Constitutes what, exactly? Crook interrupted. A legal union between two adults that created the foundation for military cooperation that achieved better results than months of conventional operations? The general's questions were exposing the fundamental weakness in the government's case. It was difficult to argue that cooperation was dangerous when it had produced better results than conflict, or that alliance was illegal when it had brought justice to criminals who had evaded conventional law enforcement. Maria Santos, who had been waiting for the right moment to present her evidence, stepped forward with a leather satchel containing documents that would reshape the entire investigation. General Crook, I have been gathering evidence about Morrison's organization for months. What I have learned will interest you greatly. The documents Maria produced revealed the true scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise and its political connections. The fake Apache raids hadn't been random criminal activity. They had been part of a coordinated effort to justify increased military spending, land seizures, and political careers built on anti-Apache sentiment. Several territorial officials, whose names appeared in Morrison's records, suddenly found themselves more interested in quietly resolving the situation than in pursuing charges against Rebecca and Joseph. The evidence suggested that some of the very men who had come to investigate and authorize cooperation had been benefiting from the violence that cooperation had ended. General Crook studied the documents with the attention of a man who understood their implications completely. It appears, he said finally, that unauthorized cooperation has accomplished something that months of authorized operations failed to achieve: the exposure and elimination of a criminal conspiracy that was manipulating both sides of this conflict for personal gain. Colonel Whitfield's confident authority was crumbling as he realized that his superior officer was not going to support the bureaucratic assault on the Apache alliance. General, military protocol still requires. Military protocol requires results, Colonel. Results that protect American lives and advance American interests. What I see here is an innovative approach that achieved both goals more effectively than conventional methods. Judge Morrison made one final attempt to salvage his legal case. General Crook, regardless of practical results, the law is clear. About marriage between whites and Indians, about unauthorized military cooperation. The law, Crook interrupted, is also clear about criminal conspiracy, false evidence, and obstruction of justice, all of which appear to be documented in these records your brother kept so carefully. The tables had turned completely. The officials who had come to prosecute Rebecca and Joseph now found themselves facing questions about their own connections to Morrison's criminal enterprise. The evidence that was supposed to exonerate the Apache alliance was instead implicating some of the very people who had come to destroy it. As the sun set over Rebecca's valley, the confrontation that had begun as a government assault on unauthorized cooperation was ending as a vindication of everything she and Joseph had fought to build. But the victory came with a sobering understanding of the forces arrayed against any change in the status quo. The bureaucratic and legal challenges they had faced were symptoms of a larger problem, a system that profited from conflict and feared the implications of peace. Their personal alliance had proven that cooperation was possible, but scaling that cooperation to transform an entire territory would require overcoming institutional resistance that went far beyond individual prejudice. Standing beside Joseph, as the government officials prepared to withdraw, Rebecca realized that their marriage had become something far more significant than either of them had originally envisioned. They hadn't just created a personal partnership. They had demonstrated a new model for relations between peoples who had been taught to see each other as eternal enemies. The question now was whether that model could survive the political and economic forces that had so much invested in maintaining the old ways of thinking. 5 years after 6 Apache warriors rode into Rebecca Hayes's valley with an impossible proposal. The transformation of the Arizona Territory had become a model studied by government officials throughout the American West. But the journey from that desperate alliance to lasting peace had required sacrifices and courage that tested every participant in ways they could never have imagined. The immediate aftermath of General Crook's intervention had brought official recognition of the Apache Army cooperation, but it had also created new challenges that threatened to overwhelm the fragile alliance Rebecca and Joseph had built. The exposure of Morrison's criminal network had implicated dozens of territorial officials, creating a power vacuum that ambitious men from both sides rushed to fill. Some Apache leaders, emboldened by the success of Joseph's approach, began demanding immediate land rights and full tribal sovereignty. Some territorial politicians, facing pressure from constituents who feared any change in the racial hierarchy, pushed for legislation that would invalidate mixed marriages and criminalize cooperation with Native Americans. The middle ground that Rebecca and Joseph represented was under assault from extremists who preferred the clarity of perpetual conflict to the complexity of genuine peace. The crisis that would ultimately determine the future of their alliance came in the spring of 1886, when a group of young Apache warriors, frustrated by the slow pace of change, launched unauthorized raids against several mining operations. The attacks provided ammunition for politicians who had been arguing that cooperation with Apache was impossible, and calls for military retaliation threatened to destroy everything the peace faction had accomplished. Rebecca found herself in the impossible position of defending Apache rights while condemning Apache violence, trying to maintain credibility with both sides, while extremists on each demanded she choose between them. The woman who had spent 8 years in solitary self-reliance was now responsible for managing political relationships that affected thousands of lives. "They're saying you're a traitor to your own race," Maria Santos told her during one of their regular meetings at the expanding homestead that had become an unofficial center for intercultural diplomacy. "The mining companies are offering rewards for information about Apache sympathizers." Joseph, whose authority within his own people was being challenged by younger warriors who considered his peaceful approach a sign of weakness, faced equally difficult pressures. "My war chief status is being questioned by men who believe that any cooperation with whites is betrayal of our ancestors," he admitted to Rebecca during one of their evening conversations on the porch where their alliance had begun. The personal dimensions of their marriage had evolved in ways that surprised both of them. What had begun as a strategic alliance had grown into genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared challenges that had forged bonds stronger than romantic love alone could have created. They had learned to communicate across cultural differences, to combine their different strengths in addressing complex problems, and to support each other through pressures that would have broken most relationships. But their personal happiness was overshadowed by the growing realization that their individual alliance, however successful, could not by itself transform an entire territory. The institutional forces that profited from conflict, mining companies that wanted Apache land, politicians who built careers on racial fear, military contractors who sold weapons to both sides, were too powerful to be overcome by example alone. Turning point came when Daniel Storm Wolfe brought news that would force everyone to confront the ultimate implications of their peace efforts. A coalition of Eastern investors, emboldened by the recent violence, was preparing to petition Congress for complete Apache removal from the territory. They had assembled a lobbying force that included former military officers, territorial governors, and business leaders whose collective influence dwarfed anything the peace faction could muster. "They're calling it the final solution to the Apache problem," Daniel reported grimly. "Complete relocation to reservations in Oklahoma, military enforcement, no exceptions for Apache who have cooperated with authorities." The proposed legislation would not only destroy the Apache community in Arizona, but would criminalize the kind of cooperation that had brought peace to Rebecca's Valley. Mixed marriages would be annulled, cooperative agreements would be voided, and anyone who had worked with Apache would face prosecution for treason. Rebecca, and Joseph, realized that their local success had made them targets for forces determined to prove that cooperation between races was impossible. Their marriage had become a symbol that threatened the racial hierarchy that maintained economic and political power structures throughout the Southwest, but their alliance had also created unexpected resources for resistance. Over 5 years, the practical benefits of Apache white cooperation had attracted supporters who valued results over ideology. Ranchers whose cattle were protected by Apache scouts, miners whose operations were secured by joint patrols, settlers whose families were safe because of early warning networks. These people had economic interests in maintaining peace. General Crook, whose military reputation gave him political influence in Washington, had become an unlikely ally who used his credibility to argue for policies based on practical effectiveness rather than racial theory. The Apache alliance has produced better security results at lower cost than any military campaign in Southwestern history, he wrote in reports that circulated among congressional leaders. Destroying it would be strategically foolish and economically wasteful. The campaign to save their alliance required Rebecca and Joseph to travel throughout the territory, speaking to groups that ranged from hostile to supportive, making the case that cooperation served everyone's interests better than conflict. Rebecca found herself addressing mining company executives, territorial legislatures, and military officers, while Joseph spoke to Apache councils, Mexican authorities, and federal investigators. Their most powerful argument was evidence rather than rhetoric. The statistics were undeniable. Violent incidents had dropped by 70% in areas where Apache white cooperation was practiced. Economic development had increased as security improved, and costs for military operations had fallen dramatically. The peace they had created was generating prosperity that benefited everyone except those who profited from conflict. But evidence alone couldn't overcome the emotional power of racial hatred and fear. At rally after rally, Rebecca and Joseph faced crowds whose hostility was based not on practical concerns, but on deep-seated beliefs about racial superiority and territorial conquest. They were fighting against ideas that had been centuries in the making, using tools of reason and evidence against weapons of prejudice and tradition. The decisive moment in their campaign came during a territorial convention in Phoenix, where delegates would vote on whether to support the congressional petition for Apache removal. The debate had raged for 3 days, with passionate arguments on both sides. When Rebecca was invited to address the convention as the final speaker, standing before an audience that included some of her most bitter enemies, Rebecca understood that this speech might determine the fate of thousands of people whose only crime was believing that cooperation was possible between different races and cultures. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, I was a woman alone, convinced that isolation was the only way to survive in this harsh territory. I had built walls around my life because I believed that other people were threats to be avoided rather than allies to be embraced. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. Then 6 Apache warriors rode into my valley with a proposal that seemed impossible, that I could find family among people I had been taught to consider enemies, that I could build a life based on cooperation rather than conflict. Rebecca's speech wasn't a political argument or an emotional appeal. It was a personal testimony about the practical benefits of choosing trust over fear, cooperation over isolation. She spoke about the economic prosperity that peace had brought to her valley, the security that mutual cooperation provided, the personal fulfillment that came from building bridges rather than walls. The question before you today, she concluded, is not whether Apache and whites can cooperate. We have proven that they can. The question is whether you will choose the prosperity that cooperation brings, or the poverty that comes from perpetual conflict. Joseph followed her speech with his own address, delivered in English he had perfected over 5 years of diplomatic work. His message was equally practical. My people want the same things your people want: security for our families, prosperity for our children, freedom to live according to our values. We have learned that these goals are achieved more easily together than apart. The vote that followed was closer than anyone had expected. The forces supporting Apache removal were well organized and well funded, but the practical benefits of cooperation had created a constituency for peace that proved surprisingly strong. When the final tally was announced, the motion to support congressional removal had failed by a margin of 12 votes. The victory in Phoenix led to similar successes throughout the territory as communities that had experienced the benefits of Apache cooperation organized to resist federal pressure for removal. The lobbying campaign in Washington faced unexpected opposition from Western representatives who had been convinced by their constituents that peace was more profitable than war. But the real vindication of Rebecca and Joseph's approach came in the form of federal legislation that established the Arizona Territory as a pilot program for what became known as the cooperative governance model. Instead of forcing Apache onto distant reservations, the new law created a framework for shared authority over territorial resources, joint law enforcement operations, and integrated economic development. The legislation was imperfect, full of compromises and limitations that satisfied no one completely. But it represented official recognition that cooperation between races was not only possible, but preferable to the endless cycle of violence and retaliation that had characterized frontier relations for generations. 10 years after their marriage, Rebecca and Joseph had built more than a successful alliance. They had created a new model for American expansion that respected native rights while promoting economic development, that achieved security through cooperation rather than conquest. Their homestead had evolved into a thriving community where Apache and white families lived as neighbors, where children learned both cultures, languages, and traditions, where businesses operated according to principles that valued sustainability and mutual benefit over short-term profit. Rebecca's isolation had ended in ways she could never have imagined when she first chose to remain alone in the desert rather than retreat to civilization. Instead of finding family through abandoning her independence, she had discovered that true independence came from building networks of mutual support and cooperation. Joseph's role had expanded from war chief to something entirely new: a leader who bridged worlds rather than defending them against each other, who built alliances rather than fighting battles, who measured success by the prosperity of all people rather than the dominance of one group. Their marriage had produced 3 children whose very existence challenged traditional categories of race and identity. The children spoke Apache and English with equal fluency, understood both cultures' traditions, and grew up assuming that cooperation between different peoples was normal rather than extraordinary. But perhaps the most significant legacy of their alliance was the network of similar partnerships that had developed throughout the Southwest. Other communities had adopted the cooperative model, creating a web of relationships that made large-scale conflict increasingly difficult to sustain. The woman, who had been alone since childhood, had discovered that the cure for isolation wasn't withdrawal from the world, but deeper engagement with it. The warriors who had risked everything on an impossible proposal had learned that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies. As Rebecca stood on her porch on their 10th wedding anniversary, watching Apache and white children play together in the yard where their alliance had begun, she understood that they had accomplished something far more important than ending a local conflict. They had proven that the American dream of diverse peoples living together in prosperity was not just an idealistic vision, but a practical possibility that could be achieved through courage, persistence, and the willingness to see beyond the boundaries that others insisted were permanent. The 6 massive Apache warriors who had ridden into her valley with an impossible proposal had not just saved their own people, they had shown an entire nation a new way forward. One alliance at a time, one family at a time, one generation at a time. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not the triumph of one people over another, but the discovery that all people could triumph together when they chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear. The story of Rebecca Hayes and Joseph Crow Feather became legend throughout the American West. Proof that even the most entrenched conflicts could be resolved when people had the courage to imagine better possibilities and the determination to make those possibilities real. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.